Well, hi, everybody, and it's great to be here with you this morning, even if it is only virtually. And my program today, as described, is about doing archaeology in collaboration with contemporary American Indians. And the specific example is from Ohio's Hopewell culture, which some of you may not know anything about. So I have a very brief introduction to that. You probably all know that Ohio has mounds and lots of them, maybe as much or more than almost any other place of a comparable size in North America. Originally, it's estimated that we had as many as 5,000, maybe even more mounds and earthen enclosures. And this is a map there from Mills, William C. Mills, Archaeological Atlas of Ohio. He was a previous curator of archaeology at the Ohio History Connection. Back then it was called the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society. But originally, as I said, there were at least 5,000 mounds. Today, with the modern archaeological inventory, we can account for about 2,000 of those. A relatively small percentage are undamaged. That is, they haven't been dug into or plowed down or considerably reduced due to development. But these mounds, I mean, we have all kinds of stereotypes or misconceptions about mounds. We tend to think that all mounds are burial mounds, and they're not. These mounds and earthworks, and by earthworks, I just mean things made of earth, whether they're simple mounds or elaborately shaped walls. They're all called earthworks, but these are the product of thousands of years, a legacy of thousands of years of ancient American Indian civilizations that built mounds at different times, often for different purposes. So you might recognize some of these famous Ohio mounds here. In the upper left, it's Miamisburg Mound, which is a mound built by the earliest founder in Ohio, which we call the Adena culture. We don't know what these people might have called themselves. There were probably different, what we would call tribes, different tribes participating in this. Miamisburg Mound is typical. Well, it's not typical. It's one of the largest of the Adena mounds, but it's a burial mound. And often the larger the burial mound in the Adena culture, the more burials there were. So it might have started out as a smaller mound, and then as communities contributed additional burials to the mound, it grew in size. Some Adena burial mounds are quite small, so this one's extraordinary. In the right, it's the Great Circle at Newark. 1,200 feet across, 4 football fields inside there, end to end. This is a geometric earthwork, an earthen wall built in the shape of a geometric shape, in this case, a circle. And these sometimes are burial sites, as we'll see with the Seip Mound. Sometimes they're not. They enclose places of sacred ceremonies. They're ancient cathedrals. In the lower left is a computerized rendering of the Fort Ancient Earthworks in southwestern Ohio. And it's also built by the Hopewell. It's also a place of sacred ceremonies, but instead of being geometric in shape, it's what's called a hilltop enclosure. That is, it follows the contours of the hilltop on which it's built. And the name Fort Ancient sort of fossilizes in the language a misconception. These looked like forts to the earliest Europeans that came here, but these also were places of ceremony, not fortifications. Fort Ancient is 3.5 miles of earthen walls with somewhere between 60 and 80 gateways. So it's more like a sieve than a fortification wall. And all these places you can still go see, and I encourage you to go see them if you haven't. Finally, down in the right-hand corner is probably the most famous mound in Ohio, Serpent Mound, which is not a burial mound. As far as we know, it was dug into in the 1880s by Frederick Putnam. It seems to be just a gigantic sculpture or representation of a great serpent spirit. And the best evidence now suggests it was built about 1,000 years ago. So different cultures, different kinds of mounds. The Hopewell culture in particular, one of these, one in this continuum of mound building cultures, thrived between about AD 1 and 400, mostly in central and southern Ohio. Its influence expanded much broader, as I'll demonstrate here in a second. But these were small communities that periodically gathered together at these places to build these giant earthworks together and to use these as their common areas of worship, but probably also a number of social interactions. These gigantic ceremonial centers were one way that these small communities could get together into much larger communities and find mating partners, found marriage partners for your sons or your daughters, meet different people, reacquaint yourselves. This shows the immense geographic extent of what archaeologists call the Hopewell Culture interaction sphere. Now, it used to be called a trade network, but I actually think, trade is always, of course, a part of this, but I don't think trade is the most important part, because these exotic materials from the literal ends of the Hopewell world are being brought into Ohio in considerable quantities. But stuff from Ohio that might have been traded, like the beautiful rainbow-colored flint at Flint Ridge, that did find its way to the ends of some of the networks in this interaction sphere, shows up there in very tiny quantities. So instead of a trade network, I think it's a pilgrimage network. People from far distant lands coming to Ohio as a kind of mecca to bring offerings, to participate in the amazing things happening at these places, and then to take with them pilgrims' tokens, small pieces of Flint Ridge flint as mementos of the journey that they made. And you can see it goes from marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, fossilized shark teeth from the Northeast, obsidian, which is this beautiful black volcanic glass that we know from its chemical signature comes from Yellowstone Park, or at least most of it. These things are coming in, being crafted into this amazing regalia, and often being deposited in mounds in a large sort of offering. And we'll see an example of that at Seip Mound. So these are what we are now calling the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, the major, best surviving remnants of the Hopewell civilization, which we are putting together and proposing to nominate as a group to the UNESCO World Heritage List. And we're getting very far along with this. Some of you may have heard of it. I don't have too much time to talk about it, but these are the premier sites that represent the diversity of this ancient architecture, but also the best surviving examples. And the Newark Earthworks you can see there are the northernmost, the Fort Ancient on the far left. We're going to focus on the Seip Earthworks down in that group of 5 sites that together make up Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. So Seip Earthworks down there in the lower left. So here in the upper right is a map of the Seip Earthworks as it looked in 1848, when Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis published their Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And that's, historically important. It was the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution. So it's got this important place, not just in the history of American archaeology, but in the history of American science more broadly. So Seip Earthworks is a geometric earthwork, but it's a special kind that we call a tripartite earthwork. And there are like 5 examples of these that look very similar, and in fact are made to the same geometries. The small circles are always the same size. The large circles are the same size. The squares are the same size. They sometimes have different configurations, and sometimes they have mounds and sometimes they don't. That central mound in that biggest circle is what we call Seip Pricer Mound. It's often just simply referred to as Seip Mound, but there's another mound in that enclosure. And so when people just say Seip Mound, archaeologists aren't sure which one they're referring to. But the big one that's shown in that big photograph before it was ever excavated is called Seip Pricer Mound. So that was excavated using what are obviously very primitive techniques back in between 1925 and 1928 by what was then called the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society. These are some of the, in particular, most remarkable objects that came from the mound. A giant spear point that wouldn't have been able to serve as a spear point because it's so huge. It made out of some kind of quartzite, a giant copper axe on the right, a copper plate at the bottom that has a bunch of shell beads affixed to it through the sort of the copper fusing it to it, a sculpture of a human face. And these are some of the most amazing artifacts because it brings an immediacy, a human connection to these ancient cultures that sometimes when we see these enigmatic artifacts that we don't understand because we don't understand the context, coming to a human face, I think brings out the humanity of the people and their accomplishments. And above that is a tortoiseshell comb, possibly an effigy of a trumpeter swan. So this is the floor plan once the archaeologists excavated it down to the base. And there's these sort of gravel or stone pavements around the outside, but inside, I think you can make out the dots that represent post molds where they found evidence that a post had been set in the ground. And there's at least 3 separate chambers represented there. And the rectangular numbered things are clay basins. Many of those were crematory basins. Some were basins where there are only artifacts found in them, but they're specially molded out of clay. They've been burned. Fires have burned within them numerous times, so that often they have a consistency of almost, of fired clay, because that's exactly what they are. And we're going to focus on the left half of the site where there's that large oval labeled burnt offering, right there where the arrow is pointing to. So the burnt offering, so-called, was 9 meters long by 3 meters wide by 23 centimeters deep. And no human remains were found in this offering, but more than 5,000 of these amazing objects made from those materials that would make up the Hopewell interaction sphere, and including other things like bear claws and bear teeth and mountain lion teeth, even alligator teeth. And again, those must have come from that Gulf region in the southeast of the United States. So the burnt offering is what some archaeologists refer to as a mega deposit. And it seems to be associated with what's called the Great Multiple Burial on the lower left and on the left. So there were extended burials of 6 people there, 4 adults and 2 children. And extended burials, we find those in Hopewell culture, but more often it tends to be cremations. So the extended burials must be something very special. And perhaps the big ceremonies that took place associated with that Great Multiple Burial, perhaps all this regalia that then gets burned in the burnt offering is sort of the sacred regalia that's decommissioned after a big ceremony and buried as an offering. And all this is happening, of course, before the mound was built, because later, after all those ceremonies are concluded, those wooden timber structures are dismantled and the mound is built over the top of the site. And why they would do that, I mean, there's a couple of answers. One, of course, is that it buries the deposits and sort of turns that mound into a memorial. But also some people think it's a spiritually charged center because of the artifacts and the human remains there. It's got incredible special significance and perhaps spiritual power associated with it. And that's why it stays, in this ceremonial center where people come back to over and over again, even after the ceremonies that preceded the mound building were concluded. So these are the 5 stone spheres that were part of that offering. They're made out of steatite, which is also called soapstone. And Henry Shetron, the excavator, the archaeologist for the Ohio History Connection who was in charge, refers to them in one of his publications as the most interesting of all the artifacts in the offering. And given some of what I've already shown you, that speaks volumes for what he thought about these objects, because they're not that big. They're about the size of marbles, as you'll see, and they're all engraved with different designs. And here's an early artist's rendering of the different designs on those. And each of them undoubtedly had some particular significance, ritual meaning that could be decoded by at least some of the people back then. But now we're having a hard time. Some of them we think we might have clues to, but really we don't know. But each is unique. So Henry Shetron, who's drawn in a caricature in the Columbus Dispatch down there on the lower right, concluded that these engraved spheres were used as marbles and had been intended for the remains of the child that had been buried in what they called Burial 13. Well, that's a very interesting story, but it doesn't align with the facts. For one thing, in the field notes, there were no artifacts found with the child in Burial 13, which is on the far left side there of the burnt offering. And also, just because it's associated with the burnt offering, that's kind of an illusion, because we're not seeing the profile. The burnt offering was first, and then there was a clay floor built over the burnt offering, and then these basins were built on top of that. So all the objects in the burnt offering were sealed under a floor. The burials put later. So it's difficult to imagine that the people who built a burnt offering or built that ceremonial basin on where 13 is for Burial 13 knew precisely what was going to be under it, or what was under it. So here's more from the field notes. 3 of the steatite spheres, they were found roughly in where those red X's are. So you can see they're much more closely associated with Burial 14, but not directly, because again, they're under the floor. And Burial 14 was a cremation, and the age and sex were not able to be determined because the remains were so thoroughly cremated. So there's absolutely no evidence that these marble-like objects had any association with Burial 13. Moreover, Jetro noted himself that the game of marbles does not appear in the complex list of games of the Native Americans of historic record. Not until the historic era after European contact did Native Americans engage in this game, and they probably got it from Europeans. So that interpretation is simply the weakest kind of analogy. Gee, that looks like a marble to me, therefore it must be a marble, a gaming marble. There have been other more sophisticated interpretations offered for these objects more recently. Some archaeologists think the spheres might be shamanic paraphernalia, and I don't think that's an absurd possible explanation. Certainly there are people, based on the artistic depictions we have in Hopewell culture, that had a role in society very much like what shamans have in the other American Indian cultures like the Ojibwe. And there seems to be a shamanistic practices in many of the American Indian societies in the Eastern Woodlands. And the one on the left there is a stone figurine from the Newark Earthworks of a human, with a bear, I don't want to say, but it's perhaps a transformation of a human into a bear and back and forth. And on the right is an engraving on bone of a shaman who's human and deer with those deer antlers. So shamans were around, but we don't have any direct evidence that these particular objects were used by these religious practitioners. So how then can archaeologists give meaning to these objects that seem so mysterious to us from our cultural perspective? Well, one way, and it seems astonishing that it's taken us, a couple hundred years to figure this out, is working with the indigenous tribes who have cultural connections with the geography of the places where these civilizations were. And I'm embarrassed to say, it didn't occur to me to go out and consult with these various tribes in order to help me understand these cultural objects. I kind of backed into it. The Ohio History Connection has been engaged in consultation with these tribes in recent years. We weren't doing it back in the 20s and 30s, obviously, nobody was. We've started, I won't say relatively late, but yeah, given the fact that we should have been doing this all along, we started relatively late. But we would go out to Oklahoma, visit with the tribes, mostly talk about other things, talk about our interpretations, talk about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and how we fulfill our responsibilities under that. But in a sidebar to one of these conferences, we were at the Eastern Shawnee, only go back to that. We were at the Eastern Shawnee, their facility there, their conference center. And that's where we were having the meeting. But a number of other tribes had been invited, including the other two Shawnee tribes, the Shawnee Tribe and the absentee Shawnee. And the Eastern Shawnee folks were showing me their little museum, and we were stopped at an exhibit of the Shawnee drum. And the gentleman there on the right, his name was Ben Barnes, and back then he was the second chief. Now he's the chief of the Shawnee Tribe. He stopped and just joined in this conversation and started talking about the Shawnee drum and his own ceremonial practices. And he said that they use a water drum in their ceremonies, and the water drum is a small kettle, and they pull a hide over it and then attach the hide to the kettle using these perfectly round black stones. And he was sort of showed this relative size, and he said they tie the hide around them and then sort of pull them all together at the bottom, and it allows them to adjust the tension of the water drum. And then there's water in the pot itself, which adds a resonance to when the drum is beaten. And I looked at him and I said, perfectly round black pebble. We have some perfectly round black pebbles in our collection. They're all engraved. Do you guys engrave designs on them? And he said, no, but we continued talking about him. And this was just in the back of my mind. And Ben came to Columbus, to the Ohio History Connection a few times. I was able to show him those. And gradually, as we continued talking, it became clear that this offered a new explanation for what these stones might be. This is a Shawnee drum that was been assembled, and it shows those round little projections where the hide is being attached. All of those contain one of these small spherical black balls. Well, we looked into the history, and we found that in the eastern woodlands, there are such drums documented. John Smith described an Algonquian water drum in 1624 as a great deep platter of wood covered with a skin and tied at each corner with a walnut. David Zeisberger in Ohio in 1780, working with the Delaware, described one of their drums as a thin deerskin stretched across a barrel, or in lieu of this, a kettle. He doesn't describe how it was affixed to that, however. So one of the things, as part of our research, I went back to the notes. Were there anything else found in Seip Mound near the pebbles, near those round spheres, that might have also been part of the drum? Now, it was a burnt offering. So all the perishable things like wood, hide, cord would all presumably have been consumed in the fire. But Chetron did find fragments of a large wooden bowl or dish in those notes close to where he'd found the steatite spheres. And the wood had been charred, so the charring preserved it. So it is possible, by no means certain, that could have been another component, a preserved component of the drum. It also could be simply a wooden bowl that had food items that were part of that offering. So we don't know, but the association at least is interesting. So we think, and actually Ben and I ended up co-authoring a paper that we published in a journal, a scientific journal, offering this as a possible hypothesis, and that this could likely be the only physical remnants left of what would be now the earliest documented drum in the eastern woodlands. This drum does figure powerfully in the sacred ceremonies of many of the tribes now, including the tribe that Ben practices his religion in. And in this painting by Ernest Spybuck, you can see a drum that has those same spherical projections that were being used to tie it on there. Another painting by Ernst Spybuck, who's an absentee Shawnee artist, but this is the, can't see it because of the label up there, but this is a different tribe. I think it says, I can't read the tribe because there's obstruction there. But so this is a dance associated with the use of this drum. So these drums still figure prominently in the ceremonial practices of American Indian groups today, and it could well extend all the way back through, and it could be a legacy, an inheritance from these deep time, 2,000 years ago ancestors. And this is actually a passage that was pulled from our joint paper. Then says, seeing my own religious identity represented in a set of 2,000-year-old stones is powerful and profound. And I can't tell you how much it means to me as an archaeologist who has devoted their life to exploring and learning about these ancient cultures, where so much information has been lost about it. And I can contribute something to my science by adding meaning to these objects, but also contribute something to indigenous peoples, to give something back to them, to say, here's a part of your heritage that, what has been lost in time, but now it clearly shows the link you have with these people. And it resulted in a temporary exhibit that we also did at the Ohio History Connection of these stones, showing the bowl there that we've been produced. We borrowed that from him, and providing some of this context. So it's been an incredibly fun experience working with the indigenous peoples who are the inheritors of this legacy to help them interpret and add to their own history. And then to be able to put that in the scientific journals and in an exhibit for the public to view as well. The exhibit's not up anymore. It was down even before the museum closed due to COVID, but we're thinking about new exhibits in the future, and this kind of thing, featuring American Indian interpretations of their own past, is going to feature more strongly in our interpretations of this material. And I mean, it just makes so much more sense than saying, oh, gee, they look like marbles, so they must have been marbles. And since in our society, kids play with marbles, these must have been associated with that kid burial, even though it's sort of over there, 10 feet away. Somehow it got displaced, but they belong together. So we'll just write the report saying they were together. I mean, wanting a hypothesis to be true and distorting data to make a better story, to fit an interpretation that you've sort of contrived out of your own cultural context. It's not the right way to do archaeology. And I don't think it was back then in the 20s either. So I've deliberately tried to leave as much time as possible for questions. I do have these acknowledgements there for you to see the people that we're thanking, but I did want to leave time for questions because it's a difficult subject. It's about the Ohio History Connection's past of digging mounds that were sacred and burial sites to ancient people and to their descendants. But it also touches on the knowledge that we can gain from studies of those old collections. And by working with indigenous people, the inspiration we can give to those people and the connections we can help to reforge that have been lost due to forced removal from their lands, cultural practices being forced to practice religions that weren't part of their own traditions. So, I mean, all of this is personally rewarding to me, and I think helps, show our discipline, provides an example of how, as a discipline, North American archaeology can move forward. So, we exit the slide presentation. Actually, maybe I'll just leave that up in case anybody has something that they want to ask me about for a particular slide, and we can go back to it.
So, Michael, you had your hand up. Did you? Were you just going to ask the question in the chat, or did you have something else?
Well, I have a couple questions actually.
Sure.
First of all, you show those balls. I mean, the first thing that popped into my mind was those balls that were found at Poverty Point, which is about 1,000 years earlier than this site. I was just wondering if anybody's ever compared these to what was found at Poverty Point.
Yeah, Poverty Point, they come in all kinds of shapes. There are some balls. I don't know a lot about them, but they're made out of ceramic. I mean, some people think they are things that were heated up, to put in soup to heat it up. Perhaps they had ritual purposes. But the thing is, they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. These are only come in spheres that are all about the same size. So it seems to me they require a different interpretation. Plus, you've got them at Poverty Point in Louisiana, 4,000, 3,000 years ago. And then 1,000 years later, you've got these up in the Ohio Valley with no evidence of like similar things in between so much. So I would argue that they required different interpretations.
Okay. And for the enclosures, you mentioned how they all have the similar dimensions. And I believe I heard somewhere that actually with the like the circles and the squares, like the dimensions are such where like these circles fit like perfectly into like the dimensions of the square. Is that true?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, I don't think that's true in this case, but in many of them, like what I've studied most in my career is the Newark Earthworks. And there is such a complex set of relationships that show that this civilization had a profound understanding of geometry as well as astronomy. Because at Newark, the main components are a circle connected to an octagon earthworks, the Great Circle, which again, I showed you that on a previous slide. We'll bring that back up, down in the upper right-hand corner there. And it was sort of connected by parallel walls to a square. And the area of the square is equal to the area of the circle that's attached to the octagon. And the circumference of the Great Circle there is equal to the perimeter of the square to which it's attached. So there is this complicated knowledge of geometry that's encoded in the structure of many of these earthworks. And we're still, I think, working out some of that. And then many of these have alignments to the rising and setting of the sun, as well as the rising and setting of the moon. Newark in particular, there are 4 rise points and 4 set points that define the lunar cycle. And the Newark octagon has alignments into it to each one of those alignments. Its main axis points to where, the moon rises at its northernmost point in its cycle of 18.6 years. Now, just as a little plug, the Ohio History Connection is hosting an open house at the Octagon Earthworks. Normally, you can't go there and see the whole site because Mound Builders Country Club is occupying the site. But on July 26th, on Monday, all day, dawn to dusk, the site is open to the public. I'll be out there with some other folks between noon and 4, answering questions. I don't believe we'll be giving tours this year for various reasons, but we'll be talking about the site and answering questions. So maybe I can meet some of you. Unfortunately, it's a Monday. Some of those open houses do happen on weekends, so keep watching for that. But yeah, there's just incredible knowledge. We look at these things, and many people say, they're just piles of dirt. They're not like giant pyramids or the Colosseum of Rome. But that's just a cultural bias. You can make marvelous things, and these ancient people did, out of earth. And many of these American Indian cultures tell us today that earth is this sacred material. So of course they build their sacred centers out of earth. Any other questions?
Now I can't remember what my question was. Yes, I do, but it just went right out of my mind.
Okay, well, maybe it'll come back before we leave.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Anybody else have any questions?
Stacia, did you have a question?
I did. You mentioned that there was a pottery floor above the
burnt offering?
Yes. Is there a time difference was there testing with the time between the two? Was it multiple occupations potentially?
Insofar as we know, there are time differences, but we think these are sequences within the single culture's use of the site. So originally, these people would build these timber structures, and those structures would be places, lodges, churches. There'd be places where important ceremonies would be performed of various kinds. And then as part of those ceremonies, sometimes, like I say, these deposits, like this burnt offering, would have been covered with this floor. And then later, people were building these crematory basins there, and then burying those under small mounds. And then eventually the whole floor is covered with these mounds. And at that point, they might dismantle the wooden structure and then build the big mound on top of it. And even with many of these sites, there are multiple stages. There's then earth added at a later time and more earth added later to make the mound even bigger. And those might be related to subsequent, 10 years later, they do a new world renewal ceremony at the site. And as part of that ceremony, add earth to the mound. So each of these sites does have a very complex history, but at least in these cases with the Hopewell culture, the history all seems to be circumscribed within a relatively short period of time, generations perhaps, 2 or 3 generations. There are examples of so-called Hopewell mounds or Adena mounds that a later culture added burials to. This is the late woodland culture. It's often called the intrusive mound culture, as if they were intruding their burials where they weren't supposed to. That's an archaeological perspective, because for archaeologists, you're messing up this nice Adena mound by adding a burial to it 1,000 years later. But I'm sure for those people who were the descendants of the people that built the mounds, it was a way, it was almost like a renewal of their religious practices, a way to, we honor the ancestors by, trying to renew the cultural practices perhaps that they were built for. They knew they were burial mounds. And so by adding current burials to them, you were trying to reawaken the spiritual power of these ancient sites. So that can be confusing. So there are instances where there's an old mound that 1,000 years later is used again for a certain practice, but it's usually very clear because, there's the existing mound with the burial added to it, and the artifacts associated with the people in that burial are very different from the artifacts we find associated with the people that were in the mound. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm going off the imagery and the pictures that you have in your archaeology book.
Okay.
I just was wondering if the whole site dates the same period or whether there's different periods for different areas, because I know there's an area that has large mounds off to the right-hand side of the picture that's left that you have here. And then you've got your circle A area 27 acres, or the square that's 27 acres. And I was just wondering if there was any large time differences between any of them. I'm not talking like cultural time periods, but I'm talking like you can tell what the initial creation was, and then if things were, as you were saying, added on to it by the same group.
Yeah, and it's very hard to tease that out because radiocarbon dating, which is our best means of dating right now, always comes with a plus or minus factor. And so it can be hard for radiocarbon dating to differentiate between something that happened 25 years ago versus something that happened 50 years ago. The plus or minus says it's all about the same time period. So I don't think we have enough of a refined time scale to place on those to see that kind of activity, except when we can see it in the layers. Like I described at Seip, that there's a ceremony that was performed when they built the burnt offering, and then a clay floor was put over it. And then at some point later, and we don't know exactly how long, but I don't think it was terribly long. I think it was probably within 5, 10, 20 years, these other cremation burials and sort of altars, clay altars, these basins were added to that surface. And then later, a mound was built over the top of everything. And was that 5 years later or 10 years later or 50 years later? I don't know, but I think all of that is encompassed within the ceremonial practices of these people. And then what's interesting with Seip, I've mentioned that there were 4 other of these 3-part earthworks. Just like a mile down the road from Seip is another one of these. So it's almost as if the community said, okay, now we've used this one. And in the same way that we've decommissioned the burials, we filled it up with burials, we built a mound over the top of it. They may have decommissioned that entire 3 giant earthwork ceremonial center and then moved over and built another one to start that ritual cycle anew, perhaps. But there are sites, Serpent Mound is a good example. These landscapes are used throughout the 15,000 years of time that people have been using here, living here. So like at Serpent Mound, you've got the Serpent, and then you've got a Fort Ancient village nearby, and you've got an Adena culture village nearby, separated by more than 1,000 years. You've got 2 Adena burial mounds and a mound that goes with the 1,000-year-old Fort Ancient culture. And part of this is what's caused all the confusion in trying to understand how old Serpent Mound is. Did the Adena build it 2,500 years ago? Or did, no, that would be more, about 2,500 years ago. Or did the Fort Ancient culture build it 1,000 years or less ago? And I've been doing a lot of research on this lately, and I think that the serpent effigy goes with the much later Fort Ancient culture, but it's actively being debated by archaeologists now. So, but in some cases, clearly you can see that landscape was used by different cultures, 2 big episodes of use, one 2,000 or more years ago, and then another one 1,000 years later. And I'm still not sure I'm getting to the answer of your question, though.
No, you are. You are. I was just interested to see if there was any evidence of multi-use, because there are so many other sites that are used by different groups that I just was interested to see if there was a storyline of how this site was created based on any time period. And I admit my experience comes more from the Mediterranean, so we have a quite tinier amount of being able to determine when things were made based on pottery, for example. So I was kind of I probably just a little bit babied by that, thinking that we can determine smaller areas of time. So I apologize for that.
No, that's okay.
But I was just interested to know, like, did the first circle with the main mound come first? Did the tiny circle come second? Like, I didn't know if there was any evidence of what came first. But that makes sense if that it's harder to determine time periods when it just happened close together is basically what we can determine, is from what I'm understanding.
Yeah, and in terms of like the 3-part enclosures, I mean, from my perspective at Newark, we know some of these earthworks, like the Fort Ancient earthworks, from the radiocarbon dating, we know that some of it was added on to and probably took many, many generations to build. And at Fort Ancient, it looks like one part of it was built, and then 100 years later, another part was added on, and then 100 years later, another part was added on. But many of these Hopewell earthworks, like these 3-part ones, and as I've argued, like for the much bigger Newark earthworks, I think these are like ceremonial machines, and there are these 3 essential components. As you can see with this tripartite earthwork, there are 5 of these that are made to the same sort of cookie cutter plan. So it seems to me that the ceremonies that are taking place there need the square, they need the small circle for something separate, and then they need the big circle with the mounds sort of in the center of it. So I think this was a plan that was in the minds of the people that built it. And if they all weren't built in the same summer, they were built as part of the same extended construction sequence according to that preconceived plan, with the alignments of the moon and sun or whatever built into it accordingly.
So, Brad, I remember my question.
Great.
Fortunately, I was an undergrad at Ohio State when Brad was a graduate. There was one professor, in fact, your advisor, I think, Bill, I can't remember his last name.
Fancy.
But one of the great disappointments of my life, he and I were supposed to go over to my great-grandfather's farm and do a quick survey because there's some great archaic sites over there, and it poured rain that day. We never got to go. That was a long time ago. But anyway, So is excavation, as in, as we traditionally know it, and some of this look like some of the stuff that Schliemann did at Troy, but I still think if he'd had backhoes, that he'd have had them there. But is that type of excavation, because of respect for Native Americans, a thing of the past, or is there still going to be physical excavation done in the state?
Absolutely. There will still be physical excavation. I mean, there are examples of like a highway is going to be built and they can't reroute it, so the site's going to be impacted. So excavation is the best way to save the knowledge. But things like this won't be done sort of out of pure research for a couple of reasons. One, and as with the Schliemann example, when you try and do an excavation on that scale, it's so destructive. I mean, you're losing all kinds of knowledge just to get at a couple of categories of knowledge that you want to get at the objects at the mound. So you lose a lot of the context when you're doing such a huge excavation. But also many of these excavations were like, let's dig to see what we can find. Now we have these amazing geophysical methods that can see into the ground before you ever have to do any digging. And the folks at Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, Brett Ruby's been working with the German Archaeological Institute, and another Ohio archaeologist, Dr. Jared Burks, has been doing amazing work with this. And then you can say, oh, look, there's this giant circle of posts that were set into the ground. And instead of excavating a big area to discover that, you see them, and then you can pick one post and excavate it and get samples from that to date. And it's much more targeted and focused to answer specific problems, in a season or maybe 2 seasons. But I do think we'll see fewer of these huge, large-scale excavations that take, several years or whatever, because we don't have to do it. I mean, it's always been a good practice not to dig all of a site. Because even in the 20s and 30s, they would recognize that archaeologists in the future are going to have better techniques, so you shouldn't dig all the site. But I think that ethic of preservation, especially now that we're getting more involvement with American Indian cultures, is becoming even more paramount, because there are more reasons to preserve it, not just because you want to save it for science, but because you want to be as minimally intrusive into these sites as possible. Plus, we're also going to be working with American Indians to find out what kinds of questions they want us to help answer with archaeology. But none of those are going to require large-scale intrusive excavations anymore. So I'm not going to be alive long enough to do an excavation like that probably the right way. So we'll do smaller things.
My other question was, as I told you in one of my emails, I just got done listening to the series on the Mesoamerican series by Edward Barnhart. And just a little bit of the Aztec thing flowing. With any of the objects that flowed into Ohio, any possibility that they were some sort of a tribute to these cultures that were here in Ohio? Is that just fanciful thinking?
I mean, are you thinking tribute in the sense of being a conquered culture, and then they're giving tribute, like, oh, we're going to give you the tribute so you don't hurt us anymore, that kind of tribute?
Maybe not so much conquered as respect.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what these things are. I mean, these things are like, people bringing offerings to show their respect, to show their reverence for the spiritual things that are taking place there. And it's like in the Vatican, for Catholics, bringing offerings to the Vatican. The kinds of things they probably have in the Vatican Museum are amazing. People going on pilgrimage to leave some gift or offering in recognition of the spiritual gift that you received going there. That's what I think these things are, for the most part.
I noticed this morning in some news feed that there's I think it was a cuneiform tablet to show the Babylonians were doing trigonometry well before the Greeks ever did it.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was pretty cool, because that was the area that I studied when I was at Ohio State, was ancient Near East, and then that got all closed down to everybody.
Well, yeah, for very different reasons.
Just quick, did you know Jack Balser?
Jack Balser, yeah, we were good friends, worked together a lot. He was
my advisor. What a wonderful man. Oh, man.
Wait, Jack Balser?
Balser,
no. Jack Balser was the former site manager at Fort Ancient.
Okay, so Jack was a history professor at Ohio State, but his specialty was Peloponnesian Wars, and so. No,
that sounds like somebody I would have liked to have known.
Oh yeah, he was an amazing guy, kind of like Paul Schuley.
Oh yeah, Paul Schuley's amazing too. Absolutely. Any other questions?
I'm gonna put a plug in for your book. Brad's written a book on Ohio archaeology. It's absolutely a gorgeous book. If you want to know about Ohio archaeology, that's the book to get. It is a beautiful book, and congratulations on it, by the way.
Thanks very much. I'm real proud of that. It was a team project, and it will be going out of print. The Orange Fraser Press isn't going to print it again. So if you're interested, buy one now.
I have a question which is not archaeology, but rather is history and migration.
Okay.
I'm involved in a lot of national groups where when people say where they're from, they first talk about where Native Americans lived, and then they say the name of the town. For example, I'm on former Duwamish land, now known as Seattle, or I'm in former Lenape land, now known as New York City. And I want to do something like that for where I live in Columbus. And every time I go to the web, I find a big circle around Columbus where it's hard to tell what groups used to live here. If I were in Wyandotte County, I'd say the Wyandot. And if I were down in Chillicothe, I'd have more options, or even in Newark. But in Columbus, I've never been able to figure out which groups used to live here. Is there a source I can go to, or do you know?
I mean, sort of broadly in historic times, we would have had Shawnee here, we would have had Delaware here, probably also Wyandotte, probably also Seneca. So, I mean, these groups would, particularly in historic Ohio, there were very few sort of villages that were just one tribe. They were often cosmopolitan places where people from other tribes would gather, particularly since these were often chaotic times when people were being displaced. I mean, the Delaware, for example, lived in New Jersey and then Pennsylvania and got pushed successively west into Ohio. And then, of course, later got completely removed from the east. But yeah, we have historically documented villages of Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte, Seneca also, and probably other tribes as well. So I think for a state like Ohio, instead of picking one, because like in Coshocton County, there was a definite Delaware center with the site that became Coshocton. So in that case, you're maybe on a little more solid ground that Delaware have the strongest connection. But for most other places, and in Chillicothe, that's mostly Shawnee history there. But even though there are these regional focuses, much of Ohio, it's probably worth recognizing the diversity and the number of tribes, because almost any of them could have been in that place at a particular time in the historic period.
Thank you. It's just something I want to say in 5 seconds and move on, but I've spent hours online trying to answer that question for my friends.
And it's so much more complicated, particularly in Ohio. If you go to the Smithsonian Handbook of North American Indians, talks about the historical period, the map shows Ohio with almost all of Ohio in a big circle, saying, yeah, these are the poorly documented tribes of the historic era. When in almost every other region, you can say, this is where the Iroquois, this is where the Abenaki, or the Navajo, nice sort of constrained areas. And Ohio was a mess in historic times because the early historic times correspond to this time of dislocation, of warfare, it was not a great time for the people, the indigenous peoples here.
Well, I'm familiar with the Greenville Treaty Line.
Yeah.
That's an important part of it. Wyandotte is sort of just north of there, I think.
Well, Bob, there's a great book out. I'm reading it right now about Tecumseh and his brother. I think it's called Tecumseh and the Prophet, the Brothers Who Defied a Nation. And if you want to get some real good, up-to-date historical information about Ohio, and boy, it is a hodgepodge because everybody was moving everywhere. It was very fluid. And I mean, even Tecumseh moved and had towns in several different places, but it's a very well-written book and really fascinating with all the amazing characters that come in and out of this. So I highly recommend it.
Well, thanks. 50 years ago, there was nobody from Somalia in Columbus, and now there's a huge number. That's not Native American, but that's just another migration.
Yep.
So Brad, do we know when the historical center is going to open back up?
As far as I know, there has not been a date determined. I'm aware of individual conversations about how much we want to and projections, but I don't want to give anybody a date to make it seem like, that's a date to count on, because that it will be announced on our webpage as soon as people come up with the time. The Ohio Village is open. You may have seen that headline.
Yeah, I saw that. Hopefully we get some new members out of this. Everybody should be a member of the High History Connection.
Thank you for that extra plug. Appreciate that.
I just attended an online event about the history of White Castle, and 2 members, or maybe 3, of the family that still is involved with White Castle were there. It was online like 6 weeks ago.
So.
Anybody have any other questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering something. I'm glad to see archaeologists finally getting around to working with Native communities. I mean, that's even when I was in graduate school, I would often go up to the archaeologists and I would ask them, if they were asking any of the local Native communities about the sites they were working at, and the most common answer was no. They had never even thought of that. Which, I mean, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I always thought that was just so weird that archaeologists weren't consulting with the people that were living near these sites. And I was kind of wondering, with these sites, especially, the Adena, the Hopewell, Mississippi, where we don't really know who the people were ancestral to. I know there's been, like for instance, with the Serpent Mound, there's been a lot of attempts to tie it to like the legends of the old woman who never dies and all that. So I was wondering, how do you go about tying these sites when you're consulting with a Native community? How do you go about deciding which Native community you're going to go to ask these questions to? Like you say, you went to the Shawnee to ask for the balls. I mean, how do you decide which ones are the most likely candidates?
Well, that's a very difficult question, but I do want to preface it with, for probably 25 years of my career, I was one of those guys that said, no, I don't talk to any American Indians. Why? What are they going to know about what happened here 2,000 years ago? So, it never occurred to me to think that with all the history and the displacement, so I was one of those guys. And it's not like I sort of had an enlightenment and said, oh, gee, we should go talk to the descendants. I was talking to the descendants about entirely different questions. And as I said, I sort of backed into this in a casual conversation where this light bulb goes on and says, black stones used in a drum. Well, that's interesting. We have black stone. So, I mean, I'm not the poster boy for how consultation about archaeological materials should be done, because, I'm ashamed that it took me this long to figure out that the tribes did have knowledge to offer. And you can't just go to the tribe and say, hey, I want to have some information about this. I mean, part of the reason that sort of serendipitous event happened with Ben and I was that we'd been going several times to meet with the tribes out in Oklahoma, showing them sort of the respect and developing a relationship. And it was that sort of series of previous meetings where nothing was being asked of them, and that's in that way, in that sort of a relationship that respect that was able to develop, that allowed that serendipity to happen. So I can't tell anybody, say, you should go talk to the Shawnee about that site. Because first of all, there was that mix of cultures, the movement around, and you never know exactly which culture has anything to do with a particular site. With regard to Serpent Mound, I mean, the Shawnee have a very strong claim, because that was, sort of at the heart of their indigenous lands in Ohio, up through, Chillicothe, which of course is I think it's a Shawnee name. Certainly it was the name for the Shawnee capital, wherever it was. So if I'm doing something in central Ohio, in the Scioto Valley, down into southern Ohio, the Shawnee tribes are a good place to ask, or a good place to go. But like I say, I would not try and go to a tribe that I did not already have a relationship with and start asking questions about what can you tell me about this. It's got to be more organic than that. And I'm sure as a cultural anthropologist, that makes perfect sense to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because I just, I was, with the Serpent Mound. I mean, the Serpent Mound, that's not the only Serpent Mound in the United States. I mean, there's actually one. I mean, I just found out, I'm from Chicago. There's actually one by the Des Plaines River near where I live in Chicago. There's actually one that they're trying to locate now that I guess they found back in the 20s, like people knew where it was, but because all the development that's been going on in Chicago since then, they've kind of lost track of it. And then I guess there's one in Florida, which they think might be, if it turns out to actually be a Serpent Mound, will actually be one of the largest ones in the United States. And, and there's all sorts of, mythology in Native American tribes that has to go with these. And I always wonder, like with the Serpent Mound, because, with the Cherokee, they have this story of the Uktena, which, combines the three worlds, the upper world, this world, and the lower world. And they talk about how in the forehead of the snake, there's like a big crystal. And so I always wonder, like, instead of being a snake swallowing an egg, maybe it's a snake with a crystal in its forehead. So, I mean, questions like that, I'm always, kind of surprised that you're not going to the local tribes and asking them this, or the, tribes. But I mean, I know with the Adena, the Hopewell, Mississippi, it's a much different thing because, there is that sort of, we don't know who the actual tribes were.
Yeah, and with like Hopewell, the geographic extent of that interaction sphere means that all the tribes in the eastern woodlands would have had some connection and maybe would have come to the Hopewell centers and gone back home. And there was this exchange of knowledge back then that, would have been similar to what was happening in the old world in different places.
Why is the serpent such a prevalent symbol? I mean, all through Dr. Barnhart's, all through the Aztecs, all those cultures, the serpent is prominent so much. What is it about serpents that the ancient people found spiritual, or do we know?
I don't know. I don't pretend to know. But there's clearly, like with Serpent Mound in Ohio today, there's a lot of fascination from a lot of different perspectives on that mound. I mean, we get more, crazy stuff going on at Serpent Mound than we do at any other of our sites of different time periods. And one theory, or notion that I have about that is that when people, I mean, it's like one of the very first guys down at Serpent Mound. His name was the minister, the Reverend Landon West. He looked at that and he saw not just any serpent, but the serpent of the Garden of Eden, and it had an apple in its mouth. And he thought that mound was built by God to mark the location of the Garden of Eden.
Okay.
And it's like, if you've been to Adams County, it's awfully nice, maybe that could be Eden, but that interpretation, that's like Henry Shetron and his marbles in the presentation I just gave. That's just, this looks like, what it would mean to me. But it just shows, I think, like with the Hopewell earthworks there that are circles and squares and arcane geometry, it's harder to sort of feel a connection to that. Unless maybe you teach geometry in high school or something. But when you go and see a snake, there's all these your own cultural overlays that you can put on that and think you understand it. I was like, I know what that is. That's the snake of the Garden of Eden. And you don't have to go to the trouble of trying to, what is the cultural context at the time? What other serpent imagery do we have at that time period? How is it used? Is it, so it's, and I think that's one reason. I think people see it and they feel a familiar connection and think they know something about it when they really don't.
I think that would be kind of an interesting study in itself. There's these ideas that, the Native Americans, that was trying to be promoted that they're one of the lost 12 tribes of Israel. and how these Native American sites were sort of co-opted by these pseudo-scientific theories. And I mean, that's even gone into the native cultures themselves. I mean, I talked to a Katuwa Cherokee, and he was like so convinced that the Cherokee were descended from the Hebrews that he was quoting me like Cherokee language equivalents to biblical stories. So, I mean, I just think that would be a fascinating story in and of itself.
Absolutely. But of course, he was probably, raised a Christian and inculcated with Christian beliefs. And that's just a way to integrate his traditional ancestry heritage with that Christian heritage.
Because didn't the postmaster of Chillicothe originally assign the mounds to what do you call the Hindus?
Yep. That was Caleb Atwater, quite a character.
The Hindus? Wow. Okay. That's strange.
I mean, in some ways, you could argue that he was saying that they came from Asia, and if that's all he was trying to say, then he wasn't wrong, because the ancestors of American Indians did come from Asia and come into the New World. But yeah, he said Hindus, and he talked about other wild, European and Asian claims that have cultural connotations, not just biological. So yeah, but people didn't know much back then, so they were filling the void with their own speculations and own preconceptions.
Okay, this was a cool question. Edward Barnhart said he gets asked all the time. If you had unlimited resources and time, what would be your one or two things that you would absolutely want to do in Ohio archaeology?
I would want to get better radiocarbon dates for the Hopewell Earthworks to really determine the time period during which these were all built. We have a handful of dates really for a number of sites. We don't have any good dates for the Newark Earthworks, for example. I think the Newark Earthworks were built all at once as part of one big ceremonial machine, but other people think the Great Circle was built first because it looks like an Adena circle with a ditch inside the circle. So I'd like personally, because I've been studying Newark Earthworks, more dates for the construction episodes at Newark. But more broadly, with infinite resources and infinite time, I would want to date all of the Hopewell Earthwork sites with lots of radiocarbon dates, so you could do these computer models to say, was it a tiny slice of time in which all of this happened as a big surge? Or is it really what it appears to be now, a multi-century span of time during which something happened over here and then something related to it happened over here? Because I'm more inclined to think that this was, well, in fact, that's not just me. The great Hopewell archaeologist Nomi Grieber, who was at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, has passed away, but she describes Hopewell, its inception as an explosion. And I think that's what it was. And I think it would have been really hard for an explosion like that to be sustained over centuries. So, I mean, we have it as a band of radiocarbon dates that's pretty wide, but it's been narrowing. We've been able to sort of refine it and say, oh, these old dates, those are too old. We know there's problems with those samples, so we can bring it in. These dates are probably too new. And I think eventually we're going to, if we had the best data possible, we might be able to refine it to maybe just a few generations, when this happened. Because otherwise, how was it sustained? Because these aren't cities where there are lots of people. There's no kings or queens or rulers of these cities. They're little tiny communities that are so small, Hopewell archaeologists don't even call them villages. We call them hamlets. Just a couple of families maybe. And hundreds or thousands of these, are coming together at certain periods of time to cooperate, to build these giant earthworks, to worship at these huge spaces. In the Great Circle by itself, I talk about this when I talk about Newark. That's during the Civil War, the grand reunion of the soldiers and sailors who'd served from Ohio had a reunion there. And the Cincinnati newspaper says 20 or 30,000 people gathered there to hear speeches from President Rutherford B. Hayes and William Tecumseh Sherman and James Garfield and others. I'm not saying that 20 or 30,000 Hopewell people or indigenous people that were part of this Hopewell religious movement ever were there at one time. But that's the scale of the architecture. The Adena built circles, but they were small circles, 200 feet, across. Those were community churches. But the Great Circle at Newark, why would these little communities want to build something so enormous? Well, I think they were cathedrals where large numbers of people from outside, these pilgrims, would come, perhaps corresponding with the northernmost rising of the moon or particular cosmic events that you could know just by watching them when it was going to happen. Then you'd plan your travel, your trip, to be at Newark for that big event. So I think maybe 10, 20,000 people could have been there on occasions. But how would that be sustained with these little societies that people may have gotten tired of, why do I have to keep building these giant earthworks when I could be out, working in the fields or hunting? So it's just an interesting question. Was the Hopewell culture a long sort of sustained thing, or was it an explosion that rose out of nowhere and then receded back very quickly? And that's a question I'd love to know the answer to.
Seems to imply either some sort of charismatic leader who could convince them to do it, or some sort of centralized leadership that could compel them to do it.
But we see no evidence of that, a centralized leader with a hierarchical leadership. Everybody lives in the same kind of house. Everybody eats the same diet. Everybody we've studied works just as hard as everybody else. Some people are buried in mounds with honors, but they're not special in other ways. It's not like later in the Mississippian culture, the guy that lives, the people that live up on top of the pyramid, literally above everybody, have more access to meat. They don't work very often. They live in a bigger house. That's very different from what's happening in Hopewell. And I mean, it's easier to see if you're the king and you have, authority to compel people to do stuff, how that could be sustained, in a dynasty. But when a charismatic person arises, that's, the best among equals or whatever they call that sort of thing, when they die, what sustains people to keep it up?
Now, forgive me, I don't know too much about the implications of NAGPRA on the study of human remains. Again, my studies have usually been European populations, so you don't have those restrictions. Have them done any isotopic analysis of human remains for like hydrogen to determine where they grew up, to see if you are having, I mean, obviously you are based on the materials, but materials aren't people. So has isotopic analysis been used to determine where these people were from, like where they were born, coming into different places? Like, for example, I know they've just done isotopic analysis on burials around Stonehenge, and have determined that there are people from the Middle East that were during their development were in the Middle East. Would that type of isotopic analysis be able to help determine the migration patterns that you're discussing about people coming from a lot of different places to these cathedrals to be buried or something like that? Is that even a possibility with MAGPRA?
It is a possibility. Some has been done some time ago. And so we have like a little window into that. And one of the problems, and I'm no expert in this at all, but I've talked to people who are experts. And one of the problems is that you have to know what the isotopic signatures are of like all these other regions, so that and can assign, when you get values for somebody, which one of those they are. And that work hasn't been done to a great extent. So when you get an isotopic value, it's like hard to say, are they from 100 miles away, or is it, where do those people come from? That work still needs to be done. But in a preliminary study that I'm aware of, they did find people buried at the Hopewell Mound group that were non-local. But what that means, and how non-local. Are they from Yellowstone Park? Are they from the Gulf of Mexico? I don't think they were able to reliably say anything other than non-local, but it's been a long time since I've looked at that dissertation. So,
Okay.
but yeah,
So
I was just going to say, moving forward, with NAGPRA and those laws, most of the institutions like ours that have ancient American Indian human remains will not allow destructive testing on those human remains unless the tribes that are most closely associated historically are in agreement with the study. But so far we haven't had anything like that where a proposal has been brought forward with tribal involvement that would even make us consider a request like that.
Speaking of legal things, what is the Mound Building Country Club? What is their stance? What's going on with that right now?
Well, some of you may or may not know that the Ohio, or the Mound Builders Country Club, leases the Octagon Earthworks from the Ohio History Connection. And in order to move forward with our World Heritage nomination and include that site, we can't have a golf course on it, or at least there has to be a time at which we can say the golf course will be gone. And they have currently an extended lease that goes for 50, 60 years. I can't remember what it is by now. And we are trying to use eminent domain to take that leasehold so that they'll have to leave sooner rather than later. And it's the property, we own the property. It's Ohio History Connection property. So it's just the lease we want to take with eminent domain process. That's working its way, it worked its way through the courts. We've had rulings favorable to us at both the Newark courts and then the Court of Appeals. And now it's gone to the Ohio Supreme Court. And we're hoping to have that decision within several months. No one knows. There's no deadline for the Supreme Court. They can take as much time as they need. But we're all sort of waiting to find out what the Supreme Court's decision will be about that.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So I don't know. To my mind, I kind of think of this almost like Spyro is to the Mississippians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like this is more like a ceremonial center of the universe for them. Because like you said,
I think that's a good comparison, I think.
Yeah. Because like you said, I mean, even though they're called forts, I mean, they're not actually forts because they'd be hard to defend because they have so many openings and all that. Yeah.
If you go to Fort Ancient, it's hard to even see the mounds part of the quote unquote fort. I took the tour down there and it's like, there's one. Oh, okay. If you say so.
Well, that's why I used as an illustration that computer rendering instead of showing you a picture, because it is so huge. I mean, Fort Ancient there, that's 3.5 miles of walls. And much of it is covered in forest right now, as it was, 100 years ago when Europeans first came there. So yeah, it's very hard to take it all in, and it's not like it's a perfect circle. Which, if you see bits and pieces of the circle, you can sort of tell that it's a complete circle. But here, it's like you don't know where those walls are going. They're going off in all directions. It seems like sometimes.
Oh, I know years ago, or I'm sure you're still working on your theory about a road from, I think it was Newark to Circleville. Is that right? An ancient road. Have you been able to do any more on that?
No, I haven't done much more on that. Other people have done things and it's not confirmed, but I think there's good evidence that these walls left Newark and extended in a perfectly straight line for at least 10 miles, maybe as much as 15 miles. And if you extend them in a perfectly straight line, it goes to Chillicothe, right to the center of Chillicothe. And that's where, Seip Mound and Hopewell Mound Group and all the sites of the Hopewell culture in that area are focused. And I proposed, just based on, well, if it goes 10 miles in that direction, it's at least pointing at the center, the epicenter of the Hopewell explosion. So I suggest it goes all the way. And one of the reasons for that is that there were the ancestral Puebloans at Chaco Canyon built long, straight roads, very similar. The Maya built long, straight roads across the Yucatan Peninsula. And we even know what the Maya called them. They were called Sacbeab, which means white road. And that's the same word they gave to the Milky Way. So I think this road at Newark is just another example of that far-flung American feature of making perfectly straight roads being a connection between these two sacred places. In this case, Newark, the northernmost of the Hopewell big centers, and Chillicothe, the epicenter of that explosion. And Caleb Atwater, we talked about him a minute ago in 1820, he's offered the first breadcrumbs about that, because he said that some people think that road goes as much as 20 or 30 miles. He says it connects with the Hocking River and ceremonial places there. And he was basing that just on the fact that in between those areas, he heard reports of people finding stretches of parallel walls running through the woods. And he was sort of connecting the dots and saying, so it's a ceremonial road that went at least as far as the Hocking River. And nobody believed him. Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis in 1848, when they came back, they didn't even mention that claim. They talk about Caleb Atwater and other places, but they don't say, oh, Atwater thought this road might go, 40 miles, 30 miles, but, he was crazy. It only goes 2.5 miles. Later in the 1860s, two brothers followed the road, and they went 6.5 miles and said it was still going. And they thought it might go to either Circleville or Chillicothe, but they didn't follow it when they had the chance. They just, let's go back home and have lunch and talk about the stuff that's really important, the big earthworks. So yeah, that's another problem I'd like to address too. Go with remote sensing and testing and work on that problem. I apologize for the phone.
And I was at Serpent Mound a couple of years ago. They said they did some analysis back in, I think it was 2012, and they said that some of the coils had actually been remodeled over time. Has there been any sort of new theories or anything as to why that might have been?
No, that's based on the geophysical discovery that up by the neck, it looks like there used to be another coil. I mean, there's a pattern in the magnetism of the coil that seems to show something shaped just like one of the other coils, as if there was a coil there that was later removed or something. So that's all we know. We're not sure if it was earlier or how it relates to the serpent, but the simplest explanation is that it was once a coil that was subsequently removed, but we don't know when. Some people say, oh, it was built by the Adena and the Fort Ancient people rebuilt it 1,000 years later and left that coil off. We have no idea how long, what the duration was between the original design and the final design. It may have been somebody laid it out and then said, no, that's not right. Take this coil off. We just want these other 3 coils here. So it might have been part of, within the 5-year span, 2-year span of its original construction. Somebody just changed their mind. We really don't know, but it's a fascinating, and I think it's probably one of the most important discoveries about Serpent Mound since Frederick Putnam did his excavations in the 1880s. It's really sort of opened up a new set of questions about the mound that we still have to answer and still have to explore.
That was there's an old illustration. I don't really know how accurate it was or whatever, but was there something like above where the quote unquote egg was originally, like a wishbone or something that was there before?
Absolutely. And that's part of something that colleagues of mine and I have argued about. I think it's very clear that there was more on the other side of that egg, that there was the serpent, there was the oval, And then there was this wishbone-shaped mound that wrapped around the egg and extended a little bit in that other direction. And I've worked with colleagues, and we have a publication using Dagia Siouan traditions. One of the colleagues I'm working with is a member of the Dagia Siouan tribe, and he thinks that this is and I agree, and there are similar representations in at Picture Cave in Missouri, pictographs that show a serpent, an oval, and a person. And the interpretation in the Dagia Siouan traditions, and possibly other traditions that just simply haven't been preserved, that might have been more widespread, is that that's the great serpent mating with first woman. And it represents a key episode in the creation story in which the serpents are defeated, the great serpent mates with first woman, and serpent woman thereby acquires his generative powers, which she uses then to create life on Earth. And so Serpent Mound and this mural, this panel at the Picture Cave show that moment when first woman acquires her power.
Thanks. Is there any theories as to how they were able to kind of communicate these dimensions across these wide areas? Because, you know, like the enclosures, like you were saying, they were so exacting. They must have, I mean, these were pre-literate people. So, I mean, has there been any sort of speculation as to how that was accomplished?
We say pre-literate because we have no stone stela, but I'm convinced that there was some way of recording knowledge, whether it was on birch bark scrolls like Historic Ojibwe did, and those simply haven't been preserved in the archaeological record, whether it was knotted cords like the quipu of the Inca that could have conveyed some of this knowledge, or whether it was just a very sophisticated oral tradition. But it's hard to imagine. I mean, simply to discover and record the 18.6-year lunar cycle, archaeoastronomers I've worked with say that particularly in an environment like Ohio, where you often can't see the sky to see where the moon's rising on a particular night, that it might have taken as much as a century to observe the repeating cycles enough to know that it's a repeating cycle. And to figure all that out. There's the northernmost rise of the moon. There's the southernmost rise of the moon. There's the northernmost rise at its minimum point, you know, all these different points that mark the lunar cycle. So that's more than a generation then. So how do you make the observations to demonstrate that there's a cycle without being able to record it, you know, unless you've got some way through tradition to pass it on? And one of the ways that's possible is that you're sitting on a hilltop to convey these stories, and you line things up with that rises by that hilltop, and then it rises by that hilltop, you know, and then see if it happens again. So there could be ways, but I think it's premature to conclude these cultures were non-literate. I mean, they may have had ways of conveying information that could be stored and passed on from generation to generation that were made on perishable materials, and we have no particular evidence for them yet. We haven't found a dry cave with the Dead Sea birch bark scrolls in them, you know, but someday maybe. Boy, wouldn't that be amazing? But it's too soon to say that they didn't have that kind of literacy.
Thanks.
Sure.